Often when I meet a client for the first time and I start to get their childhood history, they have a tendency to talk about one parent more than the other. The parent that they do talk about tends to be a very loud, toxic person, and the parent that they tend to not talk about so much is the person who was married to that very loud, toxic person. This isn't true for all of you, meaning that some clients get to me and they know up front that both of their parents were highly toxic, highly abusive, or highly mentally ill, or highly trauma survivors themselves and really abusive. But many people just tend to talk about the abuse coming from one parent. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking about, well, what about that other parent? What did they step in? Did they know about stuff? What kind of parent were they? And this video is going to be about really exploring that other parent. It's important to remember that when children are growing up, they can't tolerate the knowledge that both of their parents are highly abusive. So kids tend to idealize one of their parents and bond with them just because that they're not as mean or they're not as kind of out there. And this idealization can sort of lead to something called the more safer parent. I might ask a group of new people to me or a new client to me, like, was one of your parents more safer than the other? And oftentimes people will say one of them was, but they're not really able to say in the ways that that parent was narcissistic as well. So in this video, we're going to be looking at that. So it's important to remember that when there's a toxic parent, that the family tends to do a lot of maneuvering around that toxic parent. And it is that co-parent that does the modeling of how to maneuver around them. So what's toxic about it is like there's only one person's feelings come first, and that is the highly abusive parent. It's also important to remember that we tend to forget that this co-parent, the idealized one, the safer one, whatever we want to call it, is we tend to not see that that parent had a lot of power but chose not to use it. And that power means they maybe should have gotten a divorce. They maybe should have really stepped in and protected their kids but didn't. They should have really sort of taken a look at what was really going on but had their head in the sand about it. So we're going to be looking at that as well. That also to look at that when kids are growing up and we tend to think about the more loud, toxic parent as the one causing the damage, the one parent who doesn't really step in, they cause just as much damage within it and just as much conditioning, and you'll see what I mean. So we're going to walk through 10 points to really explore this other parent. And I want you guys to pay attention to narcissism. And we tend not to think about this co-person as having narcissistic qualities, but they just do it in a much more kind of covert way. And you'll see what I mean from the signs. So here we go. Number 1. They are not protective of their children and they're neglectful. This type of parent is pretty self-consumed. So when the toxic parent is abusing the kids, this parent is either MIA, or they're oblivious to the abuse, or they don't want to get the wrath of their toxic spouse and they don't step in. Even in later years, this type of parent is completely removed if you're dating someone that's not good for you. They have no idea about it, no opinion on it, and they don't do anything about it. Number 2, they are codependent. This means that this type of parent should probably divorce the toxic parent, but they just don't. They can either have an attitude of kill the toxic parent with kindness, and they're just trying to be seen as a worthwhile spouse to this toxic parent, which is really bad modeling for their children. Or they're engaged in some awful kind of power struggle with the toxic parent of trying to get them essentially to not be toxic. Why this is bad for the children is that what is modeled is that you're modeled to stay in a really bad relationship and make yourself selfless in some way, or engage in a really nasty power struggle. Number 3, they allow their children to be parentified, where the child is the parent. What this means is the toxic marriage is so dysfunctional that the children, let's say the oldest starts taking care of the younger kids because mom and dad are just consumed with each other, or that this type of parent who has a toxic spouse doesn't recognize that their children have needs as children, and these children just bring themselves up. Often throughout the course of these signs, as you'll see a parent who is really not engaged with their kids. Number 4, They are more loyal to toxic people than to you. Again, this type of parent who is married to a toxic parent, or even if there was a divorce, that this type of parent really has poor relationship skills, and they'll often get involved with other toxic people, romantically or otherwise. And they can really chase that person and be neglectful of their children to the point that the children don't even know if they exist or not. Number 5, they can enjoy being martyred for enduring the more toxic parent. Here is where some sneaky, covert narcissism comes in. The parent who is codependent, who sort of enjoys sympathy or applause for putting up with someone who's more toxic, well, that is really being wrapped up in their own image, and it's not coming from an authentic place. This is not good for children to see because it's modeling that the toxic person comes first, and it's much better to be the person who puts up with that, as opposed to someone who teaches authentic empowerment and boundaries. That it's also modeling that toxic people are to be endured when it should be modeled you get away from toxic people. Number 6, they teach submission and diminished self versus boundaries and empowerment. This is the classic parent who says, don't make mom mad, don't make dad mad, just be like me, just do what I do. And that is teaching children, again, to more endure and deal with the toxic parent, as opposed to really setting a hard and fast limit, getting out of there and setting empowering boundaries. Where oftentimes this type of parent can bond with their children over putting up with somebody and doing those just do what I do type tactics. And children who experience that in childhood grow up in adulthood and become codependent themselves. Number 7, they have limited ability to love their children fully. This leaves the child having a certain sense of longing for an authentic connection with this type of parent. And they can say things throughout their life that's like, oh, I can't make it, I'd love to see you, but I just can't. Or if there's a divorce, this person is sort of so engaged with their new family that they don't really sort of put the attention and care into their first children. This one's a little bit tricky, and it goes even beyond that in a way that the limited ability to love can be where I had a client who went to their mother after all these years and said, you know, my mom, my marriage is breaking up. And the first reaction from the mother was something like, well, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't I know about this? Which was a really odd response to sort of having a child who's going through this devastating thing. And that's an example of their limited ability, that they're kind of there, but they're there from a very distant place. It's an odd experience. Number 8, they can easily betray you. This can look like wait till your father gets home kind of betrayal, where the person doesn't really know that they have the ability to do some parenting and discipline or process those feelings themselves, and they always default to the toxic parent. And oftentimes this betrayal can often look like the child going, I need help with the toxic parent, and then this type of parent goes straight to the toxic parent and discloses it all there, and it becomes a big mess. Or that, you know, some big stuff comes up in the person's life, and then this person gossips with all the siblings, aunts, and uncles, and that your business is not kept confidential with this type of parent. Number 9, they don't relate to you like a normal parent would. This is not a normal adult-child relationship. Oftentimes you can wonder, are you their child or are you their confidant? Are you their child or are you their rescuer? Are you their child or are you their surrogate spouse? Are you their child versus being the cheerleader for them? Or are you their child versus their fellow survivor? Meaning they can bond with you about how terrible life is or how bad the world is, as opposed to really helping you survive and thrive in it. You can see the narcissism come through in this type of dynamic because the parent looks to the child to be the resource for them, as opposed to it being the other way around, which would be healthy, where the child looks to the adult as the emotional resource. Number 10, how they love you is confusing. What this means is that the relationship with this parent is confusing in the way that they can seem like they are invested in you, but it's always left with something a little bit empty. An example that there can be a lot of gifts without sincere connection with you about the gift. There can be huge statements of love for you without really knowing who you are or what's going on with you. There can be a lot of empty promises, and this type of parent can engage in missing huge parts of your life. And what I mean by that, if there's a divorce or something's going on, is this type of parent can be really removed from you, but puts a lot of energy into seeming like they're there. So if any of these 10 examples jumped out at you, maybe do some reflection upon what it really means. If many of these things apply to you, and if you spend some time really protecting that parent who really wasn't there for you, take your time with this. This is sort of a painful process, and it is a process. But what good can come of it is you might have an answer about where your codependency comes from. You might have an answer about if you're drawn to tragic people, that's really where that may come from. And especially if you find yourself getting triggered, this is the most important thing. If you find yourself getting triggered to friends and partners about really not being there for you, this parent might be where all of that sort of triggered energy kind of comes from. Someone who is growing up in a system like this, where one parent is toxic and the other one is kind of MIA, they can really be sensitive when people don't show up to them, and that's where most of that energy goes to. So that's the whole point to this awareness piece about doing some sort of looking at our childhoods deeper, is to find out in our present lives, how do we get triggered and how do we maybe react to people, places, things, and where does this stuff come from? And the parent who is sort of half there and not there fully is a huge, huge component to that stuff. If this was of value to you, if you like the video, hit the subscribe button. Also hit the little notification button to get new videos, which are going to be coming up more and more. And if something really jumped out to you in this video, maybe comment on the place below, because chances are there's going to be other people that relate to it as well. So take care for now, and thank you so much for watching.